welcome back to another edition of Tip of the Spear with your Missoula County Commissioners, Josh Slotnick. I'm Juanita Vero, and this is Dave Strohmeyer. And today we have special guests with us, our Director of the Office of Emergency Management, Adriane Beck. And just to start off, tell us about the role that OEM has in Missoula County.
Yeah, you bet. Well, thanks for having me here today. So Office of Emergency Management really has two divisions. We operate the 911 Center, which is more commonly referred to as a public safety answering point, where we employ 911 dispatchers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to answer all incoming 911 calls that are generated from within Missoula County and then directly dispatch the appropriate resources for those calls. And then the other side of OEM is disaster and emergency services. And in that division, our role is mandated in Montana Constitution that each jurisdiction has to have a designated DES, or Disaster and Emergency Services Coordinator, to really be that coordinating entity when something goes boom, right? And so whether that's a global pandemic, a flood, or a fire, or severe weather, our role is to be the shepherd and the manager of the emergency operations plans for how we coordinate as a community to resolve those situations.
Great. And we're just Missoula County folks.
Just Missoula County. And so we actually are one of the few county departments that through interlocal is a city and county department. So we have the role of 911 and disaster and emergency services for both the city of Missoula and the county at large.
That's a great thing, because for most people, they don't really care where those lines, jurisdictional lines are. If they call 911, they want someone there. So the word emergency, it's central to all this. I'm bringing that up because in the first big wave of coronavirus, the governor declared an emergency.
Yes.
Right now, we are obviously in a really big deal. National Guard has literally been called in. Our hospitals are swamped. Our numbers of sick folks are super high. But we're not in a declared emergency. What is that declared emergency, not declared emergency? What does that mean for us here?
Sure. So when we take kind of COVID out of the picture and we think about just a traditional sense of when we would declare an emergency, the saying goes that all emergencies begin and end locally. And so there is kind of this stepping process of how we escalate emergencies at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And really it's all tied to, some of it's tied to statutory authority that is granted under an emergency, but for most of it, it's tied to how it gets paid for. And so locally, when something happens, we ask the county commissioners or the mayor to declare an emergency locally, which then allows certain expenses to be incurred outside of our normal budget process. And then when we get to a place where we've exhausted our financial resources and or we've exhausted our actual capital resources, people and things, then we ask the state for assistance. And then the state declares an emergency and does the same thing until they've exhausted their resources, and then they request the same thing of the president to declare an emergency at the federal level. COVID was such a strange beast in that we declared a local emergency in both the city and the county at about the same time that the president at the time was declaring a national emergency. And at the same time, the state was declaring an emergency, which really was just a way of getting everybody in sync for how we were going to pay for this. Extraordinary powers we were going to use to try to contain the virus. Changes of administration, the state did rescind their emergency declaration in June. It didn't really affect us too much because we still had a local emergency declaration, but more importantly, we still had a federal overarching emergency declaration that remains in place today.
So then the differences between summer of 2020 and summer of 21, can you tell us some high-level differences or maybe even some granular differences and any lessons learned?
In the summer of 2020, we were still we had just come off of the winter where COVID was brand new, and everybody kind of had this thought that we might see a decrease in our case numbers as more people went outside and we were able to kind of come out from our caves necessarily. But we still had a state emergency declaration, and we were still operating our non-congregate shelter. We still had a lot of the public health authorities that enabled us to control the occupancy of buildings, mask mandates, those kinds of things. In summer of 2021, we were under a new administration at the state, and the
vaccines were available.
Vaccines were available, and we also came off of a legislative session where there were some changes to public health law. So public health authority, where we were no longer in a position where we could mandate group sizes and or masks. over the course of the pandemic, some of the lessons that we've learned are that it really does take a community to respond to these types of things, and whether that's government telling you what to do or people just doing the right thing, that we need to, as a government trusted entity, we need to be able to talk in a very clear voice and tell people what's going on so that they can make really good decisions. I oftentimes refer to emergency management as not emergency management at all, it's expectations management, right? And so if we can convey to the public what they're likely to expect, we find that people make better decisions, and we really can trust the public to do things if they feel like they have enough information to make those decisions. And so I think that when we look at the national landscape, the state landscape, and even locally, I think that that's the lesson that we need to learn, is that we need to trust the public, but we need to make sure that we're telling them good information.
That's great. That's great.
So, Adriane, from a DES standpoint, from an incident management standpoint, there have been a few different phases over the past year and a half or so. Maybe talk to us a little bit about standing up that initial incident management team, what its function was, and then you also played a key role in vaccinations, and then also related to Operation Shelter. So.
Sure.
If you could maybe talk about those three things.
Yeah.
Such versatility. I'm not joking. I mean, it really seems like you've expanded the kind of definition and scope, really, of what
And you
DES
ran the
do.
carnival at the fairgrounds too, didn't you?
Yeah, I was there hucking and taking money. I think that when we take any emergency, any incident, and we begin to break it down into manageable bites, then it becomes easier to manage. And I think when COVID first struck, we were all in the same kind of spiral of what's going to happen next, and what's the next wave that's going to hit us, what's the next thing that's going to knock us off our feet. And in any kind of incident management, you're trying to create that posture of being able to lean in just enough so that you don't fall forward, but that when something hits you, it doesn't knock you backwards either. And so our initial efforts were really trying to understand what was likely going to happen. And so I think our first kind of aha moment or realization that we were going to need to amass a big kind of incident management, incident coordination role was when the governor shut down schools, and how central schools are to our everyday life. And when parents can't go to work because they have young kids at home now, it just has this ripple effect through the community. And so we started thinking about, well, if kids can't go to school, we're going to need a task force that is going to look at how we're going to find childcare resources. And if people can't go to work because they have to stay home with their kids and they don't have a paycheck coming in, how are we going to help support them with food security and those kinds of things that people are going to need to survive through this ordeal. If individuals get in a situation where they are quarantined or isolated for an extended period of time and they can't leave their home, how are we going to ensure that their kids get fed and that they have the essentials that they need to maintain that isolation? And so kind of that worst case scenario, what if game that we play in emergency management is, well, if this happens, what are the potential bad things that are going to get us as a society, not necessarily as an individual? What are the things that are going to really cripple our ability as a community? And then trying to problem solve those backwards. And so in the beginning of the pandemic, we had a very unconventional model for us in that we developed all of these COAD, Community Organizations Active in Disaster task forces that were hyper-focused on these very specific things that we had identified as going to be problems that we're going to have
Like
outflow.
food security and
Food
shelter.
security and shelter. And one of the areas that I think we saw a disproportionate adverse effect was individuals who are homeless. And those that are kind of on the fringes in our society having a lot more problem with COVID and the outfall from that than any other sector of our society. And so we ended up standing up a COAD specifically focused on homelessness issues and how we kind of keep that all together and continue providing those services and don't let that get any worse than it already is.
And the vaccination piece, that was super important. And I think you guys played just a key role in helping manage what otherwise was just a overwhelming situation.
It was quite impressive in that you had this very decentralized effort. We had
Yeah.
multiple healthcare providers, the university and the health department, and private for-profit pharmacies, all with a certain amount of vaccines and different personnel issues that they had or didn't have people. And I remember at the outset feeling like, oh my gosh, this is never going to work smoothly, and people aren't going to be able to understand what to do because it's just so decentralized.
Yeah.
We made this great decision of handing it to Adriane, and you were able to really herd cats and get this very decentralized, spread out kind of leadership vacuum type situation all aligned. And of the events that unfolded over the last couple of years, it's one that I'm absolutely most proud of. We did it so smoothly. We did it. All we did was
You
say,
did it.
Adriane, you
Well,
did it.
but no, and that's the,
so how
it
did
wasn't
it happen?
Adriane. I mean, we had a phenomenal team, and one of the things that I think I'm most proud of in my tenure in emergency management is recognizing that as a community we needed an incident management team, and that requires kind of care and feeding all the time, so that when something like this happens, we're ready, and we have individuals that are trained and disciplined in the concepts of incident management and ICS, the incident command system. And so when that was given to us, as far as saying, here's a huge mess, let's see if we can figure it out, it was that incident management team and the tried and true principles of ICS, which is objectives-based management, that really enabled us to get everybody on the same page and have common objectives amongst all of the providers, because it was extremely decentralized. It was incredibly confusing to the public. It was incredibly confusing to us, as far as the information coming from the federal government down to the state, down to the locals, was completely disjointed. We were having a really hard time. One of the other kind of tenets of incident management or emergency management is planning assumptions, right? So if we can make assumptions about what we should be planning for, then our plan is much better, right? And it was really hard to get a sense of how much vaccine we were going to get, who it was going to go to, and then how ultimately we were going to get it to the population that was eligible. And if you remember, that was another huge confusing piece, is that we had federal guidelines as to who is eligible, and then we had the state kind of saying, well, no, we don't like that, we're going to do this. And so it was hard for the public to navigate. And so more than anything, we wanted to get all of the providers to have common objectives, to have a common understanding, situational awareness of what was going to happen and how it was going to happen. But then the biggest thing was we really wanted the public to understand that as well. Again, kind of building in those expectations of here's what you should expect, and then kind of taking that anxiety out of how they were going to get vaccinated, I think was really helpful. And ultimately, Missoula County continues to have the highest vaccination rate in the state, which is phenomenal.
So great. And I think one of the things that contributed to people's general sense of we don't need to panic here was a person's experience visiting Lucky's or visiting the fairgrounds, which are these two very public spaces. We got to go to both of them. Things were so smooth and so calm and orderly. There weren't lines. Things just flowed, and before you knew it, you were out and all was well. And I remember they're leaving there feeling like, oh, this is going to work.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks,
Adriane.
The first mass clinic that we did at the Adams Center, I had the same anxiety, because we'd seen, you turn on the national news and you hear these horror stories of these 80-year-olds that are dropping in line and waiting days just to try to maintain their spot in line. And we were very intentional, saying we don't want to do that. We don't want to see that, and really trying to process flow the whole thing so that wouldn't happen. But in the beginning, we crashed our phone systems, we crashed our internet platforms as to how we were trying to get people to register for their vaccine appointments, because it was like getting concert tickets to the Rolling Stones or something.
Well, I think
In short order, it smoothed out.
Yeah, I mean,
it did.
it really bespeaks to the value of the incident command system and to the value of our excellent and dedicated staff who've helped us navigate this.
We typically get lots of comments from people because things in the public sphere didn't work the way they wanted.
Sure.
We all got really positive comments. I went to Lucky's and it was great. I went to the Adams Center, it totally worked. I went to it was kind of surprising. Like, well, people are reaching out to us to say how good this went, which is truly what happened.
Not something you guys typically
No,
hear.
we're not. We don't know how to respond appropriately.
So what other developments in emergency response were you able to take out of this, or do you think will outlast the pandemic?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that, it's cheesy and it's corny to say, but disaster and emergency services, coordinators or emergency management generally is all about relationships. And it's all about having enough credibility with your relationships that when you ask them to do something, they don't say, well, who are you? They say, oh, okay, yeah, and they will come to the table and they will talk. And
when you say relationships or they, who are you? Who are you?
Right. I mean, I think that's the lesson, is that with this global pandemic, it wasn't just one sector of our kind of relationships capital, right? It wasn't a wildfire where we just need to work with the land management agencies. It was everybody. So from the power companies, the garbage service, all of those types of things, ensuring that everybody knew where to get information, everybody knew kind of how to plug in, was really important. And I think the biggest thing that we take forward from this, when we think about something going boom, when we think about what the next emergency is really figuring out that tent, so to speak, needs to be pretty big. And that when we think about our response, it needs to be a whole community response. We can't just focus on the entity that everybody thinks is in charge, because there's so many other things that it touches.
Wow, that's so good to hear.
Right now, I guess, and just focusing a little bit more on COVID before we split, and there's a lot more we could talk about in the world of emergency management, from fires and floods and
Avalanches.
Super volcanoes. I don't know, but
we don't have a plan for that. I'm just going to tell you.
But if you had more resources available to you, for dealing with our current and ongoing COVID pandemic, what would you do, if anything, different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that the best thing that we can do for anything, pandemic or otherwise, is to be resilient, and that does take resources, whether it's being resilient to climate change, being resilient to flooding, fires, and then the pandemic. And so how do we kind of instill that resiliency within our citizens, but then also within our government institutions, so that we can continue to operate, whether it's a blue sky day or we have a hurricane occurring, not in Montana probably, but
not yet, anyway.
And that kind of ingraining of a resiliency mindset does take resources, so that when we think about, going off script from a pandemic, but when we think about our greatest threat in western Montana, which is wildfires, how do we instill that resiliency in our built environment? How do we instill that resiliency in how people think about how they're going to react when there's a fire in their neighborhood that may force them from their home for 2 weeks? Because if we have a prepared public, then my job's really easy, right? We tend to be called into action when we're unprepared for what's actually happening, and then we have to amass a bunch of resources to deal with. And that's not to say that anybody that asks for help or needs help in an emergency is someone who's been asleep at the wheel and hasn't been preparing. But when people can take care of themselves and their family and their home, that's one less need that we have to try to fill in an emergency.
Great. And I bet there's a lot of folks who have more than one roll of toilet paper in their home
Right.
this experience. But.
Right.
Yeah. One thing I would just want to commend you guys on, and kind of teaching us all this lesson, is that we can flex beyond what we think our boundaries are.
Yeah.
You guys so did that with things like Operation Shelter, with the vaccine rollout, with getting involved in a giant disease pandemic, when typically your office is associated with things like wildfires. And that's a lesson we all need to internalize. We can go farther than we think we can, and we do real community good when we act that way.
Because it's collaborative. It's not necessarily horning in on someone else's turf or
Right.
flexing beyond our boundaries in a negative way. It's more
It
let's
seems an
be a community.
expansive definition of who we are, not in our little boxes, but
Right.
that we are together, and when we work that way, we do better.
Absolutely. And, I'm going to think that, my own lessons learned, and I think the three of you probably saw it on a couple of occasions when you said, Adriane, we'd like you to take on vaccinations. Okay. I'm not an expert in vaccines or anything else. Or when you say, Adriane, we'd like you to take on Operation Shelter, it's like, I'm not an expert on what causes homelessness or what the solution should be, but it's a process of problem solving. And when you can kind of step back from the root problem and say, okay, let's try to analyze this on a broad landscape, and then bring in the people who are experts in those to inform what we see as the problems. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's how you begin to tackle things outside of your normal comfort zone.
Well, we so appreciate what you've done.
Yeah, thanks so much
Thank
for
you so
joining
much.
us.
Yeah, thanks for having
coming
me.
today and for everything.
The sun came out. It's
I know.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Join us again for a future edition of Tip of the Spear.
See you later.
Take care.
Thanks.